this, a totally quiet academic basement, completely transforming into a site of absolute chaos and psychological torment in literally a matter of days. Insane, right? Well, in this explainer, we're diving into one of the most infamous psychological studies ever conducted. This all actually went down in August of 1971 at Stanford University. We're going to break down the original source material to figure out how a planned 2-week simulation of prison life spiraled so out of control, and honestly, what it reveals about some pretty terrifying truths regarding human nature.
So this brings up a massive question, and it's one that makes us all a bit uncomfortable. How quickly can totally normal, intelligent people become perpetrators of evil? We all like to think our morality is fixed, that who we are dictates what we do. But as you'll see, the events that unfolded in this study challenge absolutely everything we thought we knew about the power of a situation to just completely override our inner compass.
The whole descent into this simulated madness kicked off with a hyper-realistic, incredibly degrading intake process. Imagine this. It's a quiet Sunday morning, and actual Palo Alto City Police suddenly sweep through town, unexpectedly arresting these volunteers right at their homes. We're talking neighbors watching as these boys are spread-eagled, searched, and handcuffed. Once they got to the station, they were blindfolded, thrown into holding cells, and then hauled over to that Stanford basement. There, the researchers completely stripped them naked, sprayed them down with a delousing solution, gave them an ID number, and bolted a heavy chain right to their ankles. Just a constant, physical reminder of their oppression, even while they slept.
Now you're probably wondering, who on earth were these prisoners? Well, they were just normal kids. Seriously, they were healthy, intelligent, middle-class college boys on their summer break. They literally just answered a local newspaper ad because they wanted to make $15 a day doing a psychological study. And the researchers did extensive testing beforehand to make absolutely sure none of them had a history of crime, drug abuse, or medical disabilities. They were the most completely average guys you could find, which honestly makes what happens next deeply, deeply unsettling.
What's wild is that this immediate us versus them dynamic was created by nothing more than a simple coin flip. Half the guys became guards, half became prisoners. The prisoners were immediately put in these emasculating smocks, with no underwear by the way, and forced to wear stocking caps to simulate shaved heads. But the guards, they got matching khaki uniforms, police billy clubs, and silver-mirrored sunglasses. That sunglasses idea was actually borrowed by the head researcher from the movie Cool Hand Luke, and it was a brilliant, terrifying touch, because it prevented anyone from reading their eyes. It instantly stripped away their humanity and replaced it with this faceless, anonymous authority.
Now, the sheer speed at which this whole thing deteriorated is just staggering. Day 1 actually started relatively fine with routine counts. Everyone was kind of just feeling out their new roles. But by day 2, absolute chaos. We're talking a full-blown prisoner rebellion. The situation degraded so rapidly and became so incredibly dangerous that this meticulously planned 2-week simulation had to be completely shut down after barely 6 days. So let's look at exactly what triggered that collapse.
Right on the morning of day 2, the prisoners decided they'd had enough. They pushed back. They tried to assert their independence by ripping off those stocking caps, tearing away their ID numbers, and literally barricading themselves inside their tiny cells by shoving their beds up against the doors. They even started directly taunting and cursing right at the guards. But here is the tragic twist. Instead of stepping back and saying, "Oh, this is an expected reaction in a simulation," the guards took it personally. They felt genuinely humiliated. They completely stopped treating it like an experiment and started treating these college kids as real dangerous threats.
To take back control, the guards organically invented this terrifying psychological warfare. They used actual freezing carbon dioxide fire extinguishers to force the prisoners away from the doors. Then came the arbitrary physical punishments, forced push-ups, sometimes with a guard literally stepping on the prisoners' backs. They denied them toilet access, making them use buckets right there in their cells. But the most cunning move? They created a privileged cell for the so-called good prisoners, constantly swapping guys in and out. It was a classic divide-and-conquer tactic to breed paranoia and just completely shatter any prisoner solidarity.
It didn't take long for someone to snap. Less than 36 hours in, prisoner 8612 reached his breaking point. He started suffering from an acute emotional disturbance, crying uncontrollably and flying into these massive rages. The researchers actually tried to offer him a deal, being informant and the harassment stops. But instead of taking it, he went back to the yard and screamed to the others, "You can't leave, you can't quit." That agonizing, terrifying warning basically cemented the whole illusion. From that exact moment on, the subjects entirely stopped believing they were just in a psychological experiment. In their minds, they were truly, actually imprisoned. What we're actually witnessing here is a massive case of de-individuation. Basically, that's when you lose your personal identity and fully absorb a prescribed role. Everyone got sucked into the illusion. And I mean everyone, not just the students. It's almost unbelievable, but when the boys' own parents came for a highly restricted visiting hour, they submissively followed the guards' arbitrary rules. They complained to the warden about how tired their kids looked instead of just, pulling them out of the study. Even a visiting Catholic priest, a guy with real prison experience, fell right into a stereotypical movie-style role, telling the boys they needed to get lawyers if they wanted out. The line between role-playing and reality just completely vanished.
Get this. Even the head researcher, Philip Zimbardo, totally lost himself in his new role as prison superintendent. There's this incredible anecdote in the source material where a colleague named Gordon Bauer stopped by to visit. He just casually asked, "Say, what's the independent variable in this study?" Zimbardo later recalled flying into an intense internal rage over that question. He was sitting there anxiously trying to foil a rumored prison break, and he thought his colleague was just this effete academic fool for caring about research variables. It's completely absurd when you think about it, but Zimbardo had actually forgotten he was a psychologist running an experiment.
The sheer psychological grip of this place is really driven home during the parole board hearing on day 4. Prisoners literally sat in front of this board and offered to forfeit their entire $15 a day pay just to get paroled. Now wait a second. Remember, they only volunteered for the money in the first place. If they didn't care about the cash anymore, they could have just said, "I quit." But they didn't. When they were told to go back to their cells and wait for a decision, they just docilely obeyed. Even the ex-con consultant who was running the board admitted later that he had completely transformed into the exact kind of hateful, authoritarian official he used to despise. And the level of group conformity? It got deeply, deeply chilling. When prisoner 819 got sick and refused to eat, the guards lined up all the other prisoners and forced them to chant, "Prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner," over and over again in absolute robotic unison. Zimbardo himself noted that it sounded like a torchlight rally. The psychological hold was so intense that 819, literally sobbing hysterically, initially refused to leave the experiment because he felt he had to go back in there and prove to the others that he wasn't a bad prisoner.
We also really need to look closely at these guards. Now sure, some were fair, and a few even did small favors. But about a third of the guards became actively hostile. They took this deep, palpable joy in their arbitrary power, constantly dreaming up new, humiliating rituals for the prisoners. The absolute worst of the bunch was given the nickname John Wayne by the inmates, thanks to his macho, cowboy-like swagger and extreme sadism. He just seamlessly slipped into the role of a tormentor, showing literally zero hesitation in abusing guys who were basically his peers.
In the end, it actually took an outsider to break the spell. Dozens of people had walked through and observed the prison, but it was Christina Maslach, a visiting researcher, who finally spoke up. She saw the prisoners being marched to the bathroom late at night, bags over their heads, legs chained together, and she just flew into an emotional rage. She heroically defied the authority of the researchers, looking right at them and saying, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." She was literally the only outsider who questioned the morality of this escalating abuse. And thank goodness she did, because her intervention forced the premature end of the study the very next day.
The psychological toll on these subjects was absolutely profound. Just listen to this haunting reflection from prisoner 416. He was the subject who actually went on a hunger strike in a desperate, futile attempt to rebel. He later said, "I began to feel that the person that I was that had decided to go to prison was distant from me. I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number." Just think about that. In a mere handful of days, a bright, normal college student was entirely consumed by a totally fabricated environment, literally losing his core identity to a number on a smock.
Now let's zoom out a bit, because this wasn't just some quirky basement study. It was a dark mirror reflecting real-world institutional dehumanization. Just weeks after the Stanford experiment ended in August of 1971, the incredibly bloody Attica prison riot erupted in New York. Real prisoners violently demanded basic human rights, perfectly mirroring the exact frustrations we saw in the Stanford simulation. The suppression of that riot was brutal, and the ultimate response from the system wasn't better rehabilitation, it was just building more guard posts. The parallels of arbitrary power and systemic dehumanization here are simply impossible to ignore.
And the relevance of this source material has only grown since then. The study's notes highlight some Justice Department data that reveals a pretty staggering trend. Between 1985 and 1998, the U.S. incarcerated population more than doubled. We went from 313 inmates per 100,000 residents all the way up to 668. As the system continues to prioritize punitive, concrete and steel institutions over human values and true rehabilitation, the lessons of the Stanford Prison Experiment become glaringly urgent. It shows us clear as day exactly how total institutions can organically breed hopelessness in inmates and sadistic behavior in the people holding the keys.
The study's own discussion notes actually leave us with a deeply provocative question to chew on. If you were a guard in that basement, which type would you have become? Would you be the rare good guard? Or would the uniform, the mirrored sunglasses, and all that unchecked power slowly turn you into John Wayne? It's a terrifying thought, but it forces us to really confront the fragility of our own morality when placed inside a broken system. Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me, and definitely keep questioning the systems around you.